This is God's Quality Control 14.2.3. Here I continue my comparison of Jesus movies to the written account of him in the Gospels. I'm looking to the cinema as one possible factor in the undeserved high regard in which Jesus is widely held, given the Bible's depiction of him as not only clueless, but a downright terrible person full of really bad ideas. I'm currently working my way through the 4-part miniseries Jesus of Nazareth, directed by Franco Zeffirelli. In this video, I'm looking at the 3rd episode. Here we find that Jesus has begun to acquire a reputation. Wherever he goes, he is followed by huge crowds coming to hear him preach and bringing the sick and the lame to be healed. There are people being carried on makeshift stretchers, some limping with canes, others being led along with their eyes closed, presumably blind. Strangely, among all these people seeking wholeness, the movie draws our attention to a guy with no legs, running along on his hands. This is an incredibly sad sight to begin with, but downright heartbreaking to think that perhaps such hopefuls did indeed approach Jesus. Why heartbreaking? Because despite supposedly being omnipotent God and even resurrecting dead people whose bodies had been decaying for several days, Jesus is never depicted in the Gospels or in the movie restoring anyone who had lost or been born without a body part, not even a finger. Why would the storytellers draw our attention to this? I put the question to you guys watching. Any ideas? I always welcome your comments. At yet another sumptuous meal, Jesus discusses the law with Joseph of Arimathea and his important temple colleagues. All agreed that the greatest commandment is that we are to love the Jewish God with our entire being. Jesus asserts that the second greatest commandment is to love our neighbor as ourselves. There's a bit of pushback from the room, and one man calls out, "But who is my neighbor?" One might hope that at this point Jesus would say something about slavery, like the fact that it's not love to enslave someone, and everyone is your neighbor, so maybe slavery is a bad idea. But no, instead, Mary Magdalene, the prostitute, comes running in and flings herself to the floor, kneeling and weeping in front of Jesus and even kissing his feet. Rather than lifting her up and insisting that she's worth too much as a human being to debase herself in this fashion, Jesus criticizes his hosts for not acting like her and praises her for this abject display. Then he says to her, "Go and sin no more," as though she has chosen to be a prostitute, as though she can just quit the life and go get a job at the local McDonald's to pay her bills. Although the movie is a bit loose with the details of the narrative, the basics here are true to the gospel, especially the fact that Jesus was totally clueless concerning both slavery and prostitution. Later, Jesus delivers the speech known as the Beatitudes. You know, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. The movie departs in a huge way from the actual Beatitudes by changing one simple word in the sermon. In the movie, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for what is right," and later, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for the cause of right." In the Bible, Jesus doesn't say right. He says righteousness. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's not a small difference. According to Jesus, righteousness means obedience to the Jewish God, who gives a lot of orders to do things that aren't right. The best example ever is the story of God commanding Abraham to commit child sacrifice with his son Isaac. Abraham was going to obey, and that was credited to him as righteousness. This is, in fact, the very foundation of Christianity. But the right thing would have been for Abraham to tell God to go to hell. One night, while the rest of the disciples sleep around a campfire, Peter tries to talk Jesus out of his plan to go to Jerusalem and get himself tortured to death. Does gentle, mild Jesus, the author of compassion, kindly and clearly explain to Peter why his mission must be so? "Get behind me, Satan," says Jesus. Now you might think that Jesus was just in a bad mood, contemplating his upcoming ordeal. But no, he's that way all the time, to everyone, scolding them for their lack of understanding and paucity of faith. The movie only hints at his steady stream of scorn for the people he supposedly loves. But I have a question. Why couldn't he have chosen smarter disciples, of deeper faith? Why choose people who will constantly fall short of his standards? And why go around yelling? Where are the careful explanations full of compassion, adapted for the intelligence and spiritual abilities of the people he has chosen? Rather than going to heal his friend Lazarus, who is near death due to illness, Jesus waits for him to die, and even waits a few days for his body to decompose before going to resurrect Lazarus from the dead. On scene, Jesus commands that the stone be rolled away from the entrance to Lazarus' tomb. I have another question. Why did he command that the stone be moved? Why didn't he himself participate in moving it? And I don't mean conjure a miracle to make the stone move. I mean, why didn't he say, "Hey guys, help me move the stone," and get busy? Does he consider manual labor beneath him? Does he consider the people around him to be servants or somehow beholden to do physical labor on his behalf while he stands around picking his nose? What kind of a jerk commands other people to move the stone? This is another of many hints that Jesus did not grow up poor and had no idea what it's like to be poor. He's used to issuing rude, condescending orders and having them followed. It makes me think that perhaps his stepfather Joseph was the owner of a thriving business and Jesus was the worst kind of boss's son, lording his power over other people, putting them down when they don't understand his bad explanations, and praising them when they weep at his feet or flatter him with their unquestioning faith. As I mentioned in an earlier episode, the Jewish sect known as the Zealots are a vital part of the narrative in the movie, although the Gospel mentions them only once in passing. They're not at all part of the story. But in the movie, the Zealots discuss at length their desire to use Jesus in their cause of overthrowing the Roman Empire and establishing an independent Jewish nation. A man called Barabbas from the Zealots approaches Jesus and explains that they wish to put themselves at his disposal for guerrilla warfare against the Romans. He urges Jesus, "Tell us what to do." Jesus replies, "Love your enemies and forgive them." Barabbas is offended at the idea of forgiving the Romans because, as he says, they have butchered hundreds of innocent people, young people, old people, lives ended without mercy, without trial. It's weird to see him saying this with a straight face, given that both he and Jesus have spent their lives celebrating Moses and Joshua doing exactly those things to the people they found when they invaded the so-called Promised Land. The Zealots start to think that Jesus isn't their man after all. When Jesus heals the ailing servant of a Roman soldier, the Zealots decide they're finished with him. Then comes perhaps the weirdest scene in the whole movie. Jesus is on his way to the temple. He walks by a group of homeless people, all begging for money. One of the people is blind, and Jesus just stands there for a minute staring at him, never saying a word. Although the man can't see, knowing that someone is standing there, he begs most pitifully, while Jesus stares in stony silence and then just walks away. Later, a gang of men forcibly bring that blind man to Jesus inside the temple. The man cries out constantly to be left alone, but Jesus doesn't defend him against the mob. Instead, despite the man's repeated protests, Jesus begins preparing to force sight on him. Simon Peter even tries to talk him out of it, but Jesus insists over the man's ongoing screams of agony and outrage. Nothing like this is in the Bible. I am absolutely shocked that someone telling the Jesus story would add an entirely fabricated scene that makes Jesus look so incredibly bad. Jesus argues with the temple priests over this blind man on whom he forced sight. Unable to have a constructive conversation with anyone, Jesus goes all out with general condemnation of the priests shouted at the top of his lungs. Then he starts spewing inflammatory stuff about being the son of the Jewish God, even being that God himself. And now the crowds of people in the temple are in uproar. Barabbas, the zealot, takes advantage of the turmoil to kill a Roman soldier, and then he tries to convince the now rioting mob to apprehend and execute Jesus for being a false prophet and a blasphemer. Again, the zealots are not part of the actual gospel story, although Jesus is shown causing a number of uproars that really were at risk of becoming riots. No assassinations occurred. There is a man called Barabbas in the gospel, but he's not associated with the zealots. He never meets Jesus. None of that is from the Bible. Suddenly, Jesus and his pals find themselves sitting around in an olive grove, having somehow walked away unscathed from the riot Jesus helped to start. Nicodemus, one of the temple priests who is impressed with Jesus, comes to warn him to stay away from Jerusalem because, no surprise, he has made enemies there. This warning also doesn't happen in the Bible, but the unnecessary making of enemies definitely does. The third episode ends here, abruptly. That's 14.2.3. Thanks for watching.